Just as David and his beautiful young bride are about to exchange vows in front of an elite crowd, an unexpected guest enters the room, his ex-wife, Emily. The room falls into a stunned silence as she steps forward, her eyes locked on David, carrying a mysterious envelope. Her calm demeanor belies the intensity of her revelation, and everyone is on edge, wondering what secret she's about to unveil. As she approaches the altar, the tension reaches its peak, and David's confident composure begins to crack. What she reveals next is something that no one, not even David, could have imagined. But before we dive in, leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from today. And if this story speaks to you, hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories. In the grand ballroom of a luxurious seaside estate, David Harrington stood at the altar, the corners of his lips curling up as he looked toward the doors, expecting the arrival of his bride. The setting was perfect. The azure waves of the ocean crashed rhythmically against the rocky shore in the background, and the scent of sea salt mixed with the perfume of roses that adorned every inch of the elaborate decor. The grandeur of the occasion was fitting for one of the world's most powerful billionaires. David, now in his early 50s, looked as sharp as ever in his custom-made tuxedo, embodying the confidence of a man who had seemingly conquered every aspect of life. Beside him stood his best man, a trusted friend and fellow businessman, who occasionally nudged David playfully, teasing him about finally settling down once again. David's bride, Veronica, was young, vivacious, and the epitome of modern beauty, everything he believed he needed now to feel truly alive. He had convinced himself that his previous marriage had been a chapter best closed, and Veronica represented his fresh start, a vibrant new beginning. As the orchestra began playing the familiar wedding march, all eyes turned towards the grand double doors at the far end of the room. The ornate doors swung open, revealing not Veronica, but a figure from David's past, Emily, his ex-wife. She stood there, poised, her eyes steady and filled with an unreadable determination. A collective murmur swept through the guests as they recognized her. Emily looked different, more confident, a fierce determination burning in her eyes that hadn't been there when she had quietly signed away her marriage to David. David's confident expression faltered, confusion settling in. "Emily," he whispered under his breath, barely audible. His heart pounded, and for the first time in years, David felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He hadn't seen Emily since the day they finalized their divorce. She had simply vanished from his life, refusing the settlement he had offered, choosing instead to walk away with her dignity intact. Emily made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair pinned back in a classic style that framed her face. She looked beautiful, but there was something more, an aura of power that made everyone in the room, including David, hold their breath. Veronica, who had been waiting just outside for her grand entrance, peeked in, confusion knitting her brows. This wasn't part of the plan. As Emily reached the altar, she looked David straight in the eyes. There was no anger, no sorrow, just a calm determination that made David's stomach twist. She turned, facing the gathered guests, her voice ringing out, clear and steady. "I'm sorry to interrupt this celebration," she began, her voice carrying across the silent room. "But there is something that everyone here deserves to know. Something David has kept hidden for far too long." David's face went pale. He tried to step forward, to say something, but it was as if his feet were glued to the spot. He glanced around, seeing the shocked faces of his friends, his business partners, and most importantly Veronica, who was now standing frozen at the doorway. Emily continued, her eyes never leaving David's. "When David and I divorced, I walked away without asking for anything. I didn't want his money, his houses, or his cars. All I wanted was my freedom and the chance to rebuild my life. But what David didn't know, what he never realized, was that he left behind something far more valuable than any of his material wealth." The room was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. David felt his chest tighten, his mind racing. What was she talking about? He had made sure Emily was taken care of, that she wanted for nothing. He had given her everything, or so he thought. Emily turned slightly, her gaze softening as she gestured towards the entrance. The guests turned, and gasps echoed through the room. There, standing in the doorway, was a young boy, no older than 9 or 10. He had David's eyes, the same piercing blue that had captivated so many over the years. The boy looked around nervously, his eyes eventually finding Emily, who gave him a reassuring nod. "This is James," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve unbroken. "David, this is your son." David's world crumbled in that moment. He stumbled back, feeling the weight of her words like a physical blow. His son? How? He looked at Emily, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then back at the boy, his boy. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same strong jawline. A murmur ran through the guests, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and even pity. Veronica's face went from confusion to horror. She turned to look at David, her expression filled with betrayal. This wasn't the fairy tale wedding she had envisioned. The whispers among the guests grew louder, and David could feel the walls closing in, the judgment in their eyes piercing through his carefully constructed facade. "You never cared to know what happened to me after the divorce," Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "You were too busy chasing your idea of happiness. But while you were moving on, I was raising our son alone. And today, I brought him here not to ruin your wedding, but so that you could finally meet him. He deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know the truth." David opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was blank, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at James, the boy staring back at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. In that moment, David realized just how much he had lost, how much he had missed. The first steps, the first words, the moments that truly mattered. And for what? The thrill of youth? A fresh start? Veronica, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, turned and fled from the room, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost of the future she had imagined. David barely noticed her leaving. His eyes were locked on the boy who stood before him, the boy he had never known. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes softening. "I'm not here to ask for anything, David. I don't need your money, and neither does James. But he deserves to know where he comes from. He deserves to know his father." David felt tears welling up in his eyes. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of James. He knelt down, his eyes level with the boy's. "James," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." The boy looked at him, his eyes wide, searching David's face for the truth. Slowly he nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. David reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on James' shoulder. In that moment, everything else faded away. The guests, the whispers, the judgment. All that mattered was the boy standing before him. Emily watched, her heart aching but hopeful. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the one she had been given, and she had done her best. And now, maybe, just maybe, David would finally understand what truly mattered. The room was silent, the guests watching as David stood, his hand still on James' shoulder. He turned to Emily, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." Emily nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Make it count, David. For him." David looked at his son, then back at Emily, and for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. A chance to be the man he should have been all along. A chance to be a father. The guests, once buzzing with gossip and speculation, now watched in silence, moved by the scene unfolding before them. It wasn't the wedding they had expected, but it was a moment of truth, a moment of raw, unfiltered humanity. And as David led James down the aisle, Emily walking beside them, it was clear that this was not an ending, but a new beginning, for all of them.